Hey everyone, hope you're well. Now then, Gord Downey, Paul Langlois, Rob Baker, Johnny Fay, and Gord Sinclair, aka the Tragically Hip. Now, on the night of August 20th, 2016, this iconic Canadian rock band played their very last concert in their hometown of Kingston, Ontario. Sadly, a little over a year later, lead singer and frontman extraordinaire Gord Downey would pass away from a terminal brain tumor at the age of 53. This concert and its preceding tour was the band's final goodbye to their many fans across the country. A very brave and courageous endeavor, as Gord Downey had by this point been suffering numerous negative and very debilitating effects as a result of the destructive tumor in his brain. This, the final show of the tour, was broadcast live on the CBC, Canada's national television station, and was watched by over 11 million people. That's pretty much about a third of the population of Canada. The show had become a national cultural event, and if you had even a passing interest in Canadian music and rock and roll, it was not to be missed. Now, as a good red-blooded Canadian boy, I of course watched it and am a big fan of the Tragically Hip, or just the Hip, as we so often like to affectionately refer to them. Now, I'm going to intersperse this commentary with some classic Tragically Hip guitar riffs throughout its runtime. Because as you may know, if you've seen my channel before, that's what I do. I'm a guitar player first and foremost, and that's pretty much what drives my channel here on YouTube. Plus, who wants to hear me talk for 30 minutes straight? It's good to break things up a little bit. So, with that said, let's check out our second classic Tragically Hip guitar riff. Now then, formed in the late 80s, like I said, in Kingston, Ontario, the band pretty much reached their apex during the decade of the 90s, with a number of hugely popular releases in our home country of Canada. Actually, to tell the truth, they were released everywhere in the world, but failed to make much of a dent outside the borders of Canada. But more on that later. Regardless, they continued to produce and release great music throughout the 2000s and procure numerous rock hits during that decade and a half as well. Overall, throughout their 30-year career, they released 50 singles in Canada, the majority of which became quite well-known rock hits by the band. In fact, the Tragically Hip had so many hits within the confines of Canada that when they finally released a greatest hits album back in 2005 entitled Your Favorites, it ran to 37 tracks, requiring a double album to fit them all in. And they still had over 10 years of music to write, record, and release after this compilation album's release in '05. But, to be fair and somewhat honest, none of these later releases as fully cohesive albums would really match or measure up to their brilliant 90s output, but especially the band's absolute high mark release, 1992's masterpiece album, Fully Completely. An album wherein 7 of its 12 tracks are considered classic and essential Tragically Hip cuts, pretty much every one of them becoming major rock hits here in Canada, but none more so from that album than this one. So then, if that song does not sound familiar to you, why? Why don't you know who the Tragically Hip are? You know, if you're one of the many non Canadians who watch my channel, or maybe you're a non Canadian checking out my channel for the very first time. Now, of course, many of you will know the Tragically Hip. They're not that obscure, but it's a question that us Canadians have been asking ourselves over and over again for nearly 30 years. Why didn't these guys break big, like really big, all over the world? But especially in the most important musical market in the world, you know, the one down there, right below us in the US. Theories abound, of course. The most cited one being that their music was just too Canadian. Outsiders simply just didn't get it. Too many Canadian references in their lyrics, so on and so forth. And to that theory, I say bullshit. Midnight Oil, Men at Work, just two examples from Australia, found major worldwide success singing about Vegemite sandwiches and the plight of Australian Aboriginals. So I don't buy into the whole too Canadian nonsense. Good music is good music is good music, regardless if the words Toronto, prairies, hockey, or prime minister pop up occasionally in the lyrics. There are certainly more reasonable theories that have been put forward over the years that seem to make much more sense to me with regards to this issue. So those will be the ones that we will discuss at present. Two big factors, actually. First one being that their international and American record labels pretty much sucked when compared to their Canadian label and didn't properly push and promote the band internationally when they really needed that push early on in their career. They seriously dropped the ball and let the band down. Second thing being their failure to garner any interest from the mighty MTV. MTV took one look at the band's early videos and said, nope, not going to fly on MTV. And that was it. In the 80s and 90s, if you didn't have the support of MTV in America, you barely stood a chance of success in the US. When you're a band at your apex in the early to mid 90s and MTV decides to ignore you, there's little coming back from that later in your career when maybe the majority of your greatest material is now behind you. And speaking of great material, let's have another riff break. Now then, as I stated, it didn't happen for the hip internationally. We Canadians can puzzle over that until the end of time, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. It just simply didn't happen for these guys. Every country has their mega bands who just don't break elsewhere in the world. Sometimes it's nothing more mysterious than that. Plus, the hip were going head to head against grunge in the early 90s, which was absolutely exploding in popularity in the US and everywhere in the world for that matter. While alt roots rock, which is kind of what the hip were putting forth in their music, was at the time a bit of a tougher sell to the mainstream, I suppose. So I just called the Tragically Hip an alt roots rock act. A fair descriptor, I suppose. But what or maybe who exactly do the hips sound like in a more general sense? Now, the main consensus is, if we can possibly pigeonhole the hip, because they were quite eclectic in their sound over the years, is that they were kind of Canada's answer to REM. And as I've also been a big fan of REM throughout their long career, I can to some degree buy into that descriptor as well. Their music was quite similar at times, and Gord Downie and Michael Stipe of REM were pretty much cut from the same cloth, both vocally and lyrically, and as eccentric and dynamic frontmen as well, to some degree. Maybe the Tragically Hip at times had a bit more of a straight ahead rock sound, a la their heroes, the Rolling Stones, and could be a bit less alt indie rock sounding than early REM, but the comparison is fair, I suppose. Now, take REM's 1994 album Monster, when they pretty much went fully electric, dropped all the mandolins, pianos, and acoustic guitars and whatnot. Probably the closest the two bands have ever sounded. But with regards to REM and the Tragically Hip, let's back up here just a little bit. REM, of course, while progressively getting bigger and bigger throughout the 80s, eventually found massive household name level success, buoyed heavily on MTV's love affair with the band, especially with their highly stylized, colorful, and no doubt very expensive video releases. Losing My Religion being the real game changer for REM in this regard. Now, alternatively, at the time, the Tragically Hip were producing rather amateurish, self-produced, low-budget video releases. No doubt, a big part of the reason MTV decided to take a pass on the band. But, to be fair, they were a new band in the early 90s, at the very beginning of their career, unlike REM, with only an album or two under their belts. And budgets for video production at this stage of the game was no doubt rather tight for the band. That said, the music itself was tight and getting tighter as the 90s progressed. And as they found more and more success within the confines of Canada, they eventually did find the budgets for better and higher quality video releases. But alas, MTV still took no notice. I think they had made their minds up early about the band, held firm, and were reluctant to give the band a second chance. And that is my theory, but it makes sense to me. Better than they're too Canadian. MTV and music videos held a hell of a lot of sway in the 80s and 90s with regards to who made it big in America and who didn't. And if you know the Tragically Hip and you've seen them before, they're not the most glamorous looking bunch of rock stars. Just five average looking blokes from Kingston, Ontario. And aside from Gord Downie himself being an absolutely dynamic and mesmerizing frontman to watch, the rest of the guys in the Hip, for the most part, just stood in spot and played their instruments. Apart from Downie, they weren't the most exciting, theatrical bunch of guys to behold in a live setting, from a standpoint of stage performance. But to be fair, there was really no competing with Downie in this regard. He was the focus for sure and had a stage presence that was absolutely hypnotic to watch and to listen to for that matter. Downie had enough presence and energy to keep the crowd well entertained without a guitarist or two spinning instruments behind their backs and running around the stage like jackrabbits and posing and whatnot. Plus, he was a masterful lyricist, more poet than songwriter at times. And this seems like a good time for another riff break. Right then, so they didn't make it in America. That we've already established. Or did they? Well, we already know that they didn't break big time in America, or worldwide for that matter. But they did find an international audience. Hell, they played Saturday Night Live in 1995, though in my opinion chose the wrong two songs to perform that night, even though one of them is my favorite Tragically Hip song of all time. were the supporting act for a number of shows to Robert Plant and Jimmy Page's reunion tour of the States in the 90s. Likewise with the Rolling Stones in Europe. They even had a main stage performance at Woodstock 99, so on and so forth. So lots of exposure. Enough exposure to find pockets of interest in many markets in the US and elsewhere. But like I said, not enough to propel the band into the kind of success that they were enjoying at home. In the US and Europe, they were pretty much a theater, small concert hall band, 800 to 2,000 seaters, which they routinely sold out. Granted, it was mostly Canadian expats attending all of these shows, which was another issue altogether in them not finding a greater American or international audience. Expat Canadians were buying up all of these concert hall tickets in a hurry, leaving none for the locals to check out the band should they wish to. A bit of an odd predicament, really, to be in, to tell the truth, especially if you're a band trying to reach a new audience. But, in the grand scheme of rock and roll, when it comes to success and fame, the vast majority of bands don't make it at all. To reach the level of concert hall recognition in America and Europe was something. It was international success to some degree. It's just that here at home in Canada, they were playing 10 to 20,000 seat arenas and selling them out every night. The dichotomy of that must have been rather stark, to say the least. I suppose especially on the Canadian border states, to sell out the 15,000 seat Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto one night, only to play an intimate theater with a max capacity of 800 or so an hour away in Buffalo just a few nights later. Really strange. Regardless, the band themselves seem to have taken the whole thing in stride and accepted things for what they were. Their popularity was so great within Canada that it more than satisfied them creatively and I suppose financially. Hell, maybe they actually enjoyed the relative anonymity and intimate shows outside the country because they certainly didn't have that at home. For a bunch of plain-faced boys from Kingston, they were instantly recognizable to the majority of Canadian music fans on the street. Arguably one of the greatest and most successful bands Canada has ever produced, at least domestically. Despite it all, the majority of us are more than happy to call them our very own. The more that you, the world, ignored them over the years, the happier we were to lay our own claim to them. They became Canada's band, and we're damn proud of them and the success they've achieved both domestically and abroad. And this seems like a good time for a riff break. Good then. Before I finish up, I just want to talk about the music a little more and what is my all-time favorite track by the Tragically Hip, because I do have one. And it's one of the darkest, most tragic songs the band ever wrote, from arguably the band's darkest, gloomiest, and most downbeat album, 1994's brilliant Day for Night. That track is Nautical Disaster. I personally think that this is the greatest song the band ever wrote, both musically and lyrically, despite its rather dark and disturbing subject matter. If you're not familiar with it, I'll post a link to it down in the description box. Nautical Disaster, as far as I can tell, is a tale about the likely torpedoing of what was probably a troop transport ship during World War II, wherein 4,000 men die in the waters off the coast of France. Its lone crew of lifeboat survivors, out of necessity, proceed to kick their drowning comrades back into the water to die because they can't fit them in the 10-man lifeboat. It's a rather wrenching tale of a life and death struggle to survive. Or, as Gord Downie put it in the lyrics, the selection was quick, the crew was picked in order, and those left in the water got kicked off our pant legs and we headed for home. Those lyrics give me chills every time I hear them. Or the final line of the song, as the narrator in the song is relaying and retelling the tale. Our conversation is as faint a sound in my memory as are those fingernails scratching on the hull. Really creepy lyrics, but a really, really fantastic song by the Tragically Hip. I overall tend to gravitate towards the Hip's darker, more down-tempo stuff. I tried to think of my top 5 favorite tracks, and they're almost all the slower, darker fare. Nautical Disaster, which I've already mentioned, the fantastic Long Time Running, It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, Locked in the Trunk of a Car, Looking for a Place to Happen, and of course, Wheat Kings from Fully Completely. In my opinion, the second greatest song the band ever wrote behind Nautical Disaster, and one of their most well-known tracks overall. I think that was 6 picks, was it not? Oh well. Anyway, that is just 5 or 6 of my favorite Tragically Hip tracks. Some of these even bordering on deep cuts, and not the massive hits. The likes of Courage, Bob Cajun, 100th Meridian, Blow It High Dough, New Orleans is Sinking, Ahead by a Century, 50 Mission Cap, Fireworks. The list goes on and on and on. Like I said, they had a hell of a lot of hits here in Canada. And let's listen to one right now. I, for one, miss the hell out of this band, as do a heck of a lot of other people. Just a remarkable body of work put down over the band's long 30-year career. I actually met the band a couple of times over the years. Had lunch one afternoon with guitarist Rob Baker and his wife through an acquaintance. He just showed up and I'm like, hey, you're Rob Baker of the Tragically Hip. Another time I bumped into them at the airport in my hometown, and we drank together for a couple of hours in the airport bar while we waited for our plane to take off. Just a fantastic bunch of guys personally as well. Got myself a bit lost in the airport upon landing, and they gathered me up and helped me find my way to the luggage carousel as well. So yeah, just a great bunch of guys. And there you have it. That is my appreciation to the Tragically Hip. Gord, wherever you are, I hope you're at peace, my friend. Your death broke our collective hearts as a country, and as huge fans of your music, you will certainly not be forgotten. To the rest of the guys of the Tragically Hip, thank you for all the great music and fantastic concerts over the years. You've been a hell of a bunch of musical ambassadors for our great country. We miss you guys terribly. Hope you're all kicking back, enjoying a cold one and all the fruits of your labors over the years. You've well deserved it. And that's it. That's, as they say, that is all I got to say about that one. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you're well out there in your little guitar corner of the world, wherever that may find you. Take care of yourselves and those around you, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.